Good afternoon. Mike, it is a real delight and pleasure to see you here at the Conduit. I don't even know if you remember the first time we met, because I remember it vividly, but it was 1998, and I had just finished work as Executive Secretary of South Africa's Truth Commission, and I'd come to New York to do a master's in law at NYU. And I'd written a paper for a law journal making the argument that South Africa's amnesty arrangements ought to be, as quirky as they were at the time, ought to be held to be in compliance with international human rights law, notwithstanding the fact that they gave amnesty for some quite serious crimes, given the peculiarities and the nature of our transition. And Norman Dawson, who was a professor at NYU, who also chaired the board, I believe, or was a board member of Mike's organization that he set up, then the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, and then renamed Human Rights First, read the paper, thought it was worthy of publication, and sent it to Mike to have a look at. And I think Mike had a sharp inhalation of breath and said, well, I'm not sure that South Africa's amnesty should necessarily become the archetype. And so there, as a very young man at that point, I came to see a very established figure in the New York human rights firmament, and we had a rich conversation about international law and the complexities of it. And I remember it to this day. And as I read this book, I thought, some of the kind of moral complexities that you deal with in this book resonate with that original conversation. Do you remember that time?
I wish I did.
Okay. I made a huge impression, obviously. Anyway, the punchline was that I think Mike persuaded Norman that I shouldn't publish that article, and the rest is history.
Sorry
there we go. This book is a kind of, some ways, a summation of your career to date, some of the most important questions about how corporations ought to be held accountable and abide by human rights standards. And some of the book is about the sticks that should apply when they don't do so, and some is about the carrots that they should be provided with and the inducements to perform well. And you start off by saying that you think there's some big macro trends that are going to mean that corporations are going to have to be more attentive to human rights. And I wanted to I'm going to whip up the three and then ask you what you think about. So Mike says, biggest companies are wealthier and more powerful than many governments. People have lost faith in government's abilities to fix problems, and technology has made us more aware of human rights abuse. And those three trends are causing corporates to be more in this space. Can you talk through a little bit of why you think those trends are going to cause us to be, corporates to be more attentive to human rights concerns?
So, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for having me. I think the most important thing of the three is that governments, we want to live in a world where 193 governments are protecting their own people. We don't live in that world. And in fact, a majority of people live in places where governments are either unwilling or unable to protect their people. So that creates what I call a governance gap. And you combine that with the growing power of big corporations in a globalized environment, and you have this disconnect. And so on the one hand, as I say, and as you just said, people have lost faith in government in these places where there's a governance gap. But even in our own societies, here I am coming from the United States, and to say the least, our government is in a crisis. And so people are looking for ways to solve problems. And because companies have assumed such a great role economically, it's inevitable that they're going to be asked to do more. So companies are feeling the pressure. Here we are, we're Walmart in Bangladesh, we're Shell Oil in Nigeria, we're Glencore in the Congo, we're Meta everywhere. What are we supposed to be doing? I think that's the first most important point. The second thing related to technology is that every big company is living in a fishbowl. And so in Papua New Guinea, a decade, 15 years ago, there was a gold mine owned by Barrick, Canadian company, and there were women around the mine site in this very remote place being raped by local security people tied to the mine site. And somebody had a camera, somebody had a cell phone, a smartphone, and all of a sudden it's up on the web. And hours later, there's people literally standing in Toronto in front of Barrick's headquarters saying, what are you doing about it? And they're sitting there going, how did anybody know? Well, the world now is connected in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago, and that has an inevitable effect.
So one of the things about the Conduit in this place is that we're temperamentally inclined towards optimism. But I want to, we're also not kind of Panglossian or just like unreasonably optimistic. So I want to kind of push a little bit on this idea that this moment in history, there are these mega trends which are steering corporations towards greater human rights consciousness. Because you could argue the three trends that you've set out here, we're all swimming against the tide. Because corporations are so powerful, they're less accountable. Because people are disaffected, you see a rise of the populist right, and you see that in the US today. This is corporates and the government are definitely disinclined, less inclined towards human rights than they arguably have been in the last half century. And technology has maybe numbed us. Maybe we've just, sure, we see all the stuff all the time, but everybody grows up with phones. We're able to see all atrocities all the time, but is it taking people in the wealthy West and stirring them to action in the way that it maybe was a decade ago?
So I'm also a chronic optimist. I've been working in human rights for decades, and I've seen too much change. South African apartheid, the troubles in Northern Ireland, Eastern Europe, all of that. I think we are inevitably going to be a different world in 10 or 15 years because of the changing demographic of our society, including rich Western countries. Women, millennials, Gen Z, care a lot about these issues more than old white guys like me. And you see it in the investment sector beginning to make a difference. You see it among consumers. And you really see it among employees. And so I talk to a lot of companies, all of the attributes you described. There's a bit of cynicism. We're in it to, follow Milton Friedman's imperative of maximizing returns in the short term. But we're concerned about who we're hiring. We want to hire the best people, and we want to retain them. And the people that are coming to us out of law school, out of business school, are saying, we want to know, what do you stand for? How are you dealing with climate? How are you dealing with global supply chains and whatever? So I think there's a generational change, and there's a change because of the diversification of our societies more broadly. And I think that's having an effect. Secondly, it's slow and not linear, but there's no doubt that more regulation is coming. So the Europeans are now struggling with what they called due diligence directive. They postponed it for 2 years. The Germans are getting less enthusiastic. There's a lot of bumps in the road, but there are literally now dozens of regulations in the last 5 or 6 years coming out of Europe, coming out of Australia, coming out of California, and coming out of the UK. And those regulations are beginning to redefine the relationship, again, between big Western companies that are operating globally and the way in which they operate throughout their system.
So you wrote this book prior to the US elections, and I want to spend the majority of our talk not talking about America, and I want to talk about Bangladesh and Saudi and China and a whole bunch of other things that you deal with in the book. But you did, as serendipity would have, an op-ed appeared today in the New York Times written by you, so it's breaking news, about the deconstruction or hobbling of the unit within the State Department that you actually led. And so in the one breath, there is sort of increased regulation and increased scrutiny. And what we're seeing in the US is fewer regulations and significant declines in scrutiny. So would you just give the outline of your op-ed piece? And then my follow-up is, give us a reason for optimism at this moment in relation to the US, Mike. Go on.
The only optimism I can have is that it can't get worse. We're really, I describe it as a 5-alarm fire. We have a president that's ethically challenged. It's a transactional approach to government, hollowing out of the federal government, taking aim at independent media. The list goes on and on. The piece is really about the Bureau, the Human Rights Bureau in the State Department that was created almost 50 years ago with bipartisan support, and including by Marco Rubio, who's now the Secretary of State, and as part of the DOGE, as part of the deconstruction of the State Department and the federal government, they've taken a number of steps to basically downgrade it, to get rid of some offices, and diminish its importance and its influence. So I write about that and say, this is not a good thing. At the end of the day, I do think, here's the optimism. We're in a deep crisis. We're really in a democratic crisis. But I think both because of the overreach, which is extreme, in the face of all kinds of issues with airline safety, they're cutting air traffic controllers. They're cutting people that predict the weather. They're cutting people who protect us from unsafe foods and drugs. There's a whole range of things that make no practical sense, and I think there'll be a increasing recognition it's not working. Secondly, I think there is a sense, and with a pretty deep sense in the American people, that this is not what they bargained for, even though there's still 35% of the people that voted for Trump that are going to continue to support him no matter what. Those are people who are very disaffected, angry, fearful, etc. He's their voice. But I think there's a lot of people in the middle, a lot of moderates, a lot of independents that are saying this just goes too far. So I think I've said to people, we spent the first 2 or 3 months, I think, in paralysis, in denial, in shock, and now we're entering a phase where people are beginning to say, okay, what do we do about it? And I think we're going to see through the courts and through collective action, which I think is really important, we're going to begin to see people stepping up more than we've seen in the last 3 months. And I would hope by the fall, we're going to see some serious efforts to try to challenge the most extreme things. We're not going to end this. He's going to be president for 4 years, controls the Congress for 2. But this is so surreal and counter to 250 years of democratic tradition that I think inevitably we are going to defeat Trumpism, but it's going to come with a cost. A lot of people are going to suffer in the meantime.
So my last question on this is, it may be that you have 4 years of this, but sitting outside of the US and watching this play out in terms of the impact of the perception of America as a reliable partner, an entity you can trust, a non-transactional guarantor of human rights, even if its track record has been imperfect at best prior to this. There's nobody has a monopoly on double standards on human rights. No administration has a monopoly on that. Is there a risk, because you've worked on these issues globally, that the impact will be much longer than this administration, and the rollback will take, will permeate longer, and therefore other human rights actors and NGOs and states are going to be mopping up this damage for decades to come?
I think it will take decades, and part of what is lost is reputation and trust. At the end of the day, people around the world have come to see, okay, well, there's certain things we don't like about the United States. It's arrogant, it sort of overreaches, but there are some values that reinforce what we're trying to do. It'll take a long time to repair that damage. I have no doubt about that. On the other hand, I also think it's an opportunity for the UK, for Europe, and others to to actually step up and make this a more collaborative exercise. The U.S. has dominated, for example, funding the UN, funding the Red Cross, funding institutions, the Refugee Office, et cetera, in ways that I think probably are unhealthy. And so there's been a sense, okay, we'll let the U.S. fund it and kind of call the tune. I think there's an opportunity now for a more level playing field to have more voices, more diverse voices, and that's a good thing. So this is a moment, I think, actually for Europe, for UK and others, to sort of step up and say, okay, how do we take the bull by the horns? How do we take greater responsibility ourselves? We've seen it with the Ukraine-Russia, for example, where the British Prime Minister and the Canadians and others have stood up and said, and the European Union has stood up and said, we're gonna continue to support democracy and we're gonna oppose an illegal invasion, even though Donald Trump seems to think that the Ukrainians invaded Russia.
Is there an opportunity to stitch together at this moment in history a broader coalition of kind of human rights supporting nations that go beyond Europe? Because my anxiety is the US steps off the global playing field. Europe, with its own history and complexities of colonialism and its own issues of double standard, is the last man or woman standing. Is there a Canada or a Japan or a South Korea or a Chile or Brazil plus Europe that there's some opportunity to reconfigure human rights support in a more multilateral format that might be more distribute things in a way that's not just resource, but also the politics of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's been talk of that for a very long time. It hasn't materialized, and I think this is an opportunity, but it will require, again, states in the global south that are not Australia or Canada to say, okay, we actually own this and we care enough about these things that we're going to actually dig in and be part of the solution. We're not there yet,
Great.
But I would love to see it.
Okay, so now I want to take you back to Bangladesh because you have a very interesting chapter in the book that deals with Bangladesh and with Rana Plaza and the question of supply chain transparency and issues around working conditions and slave labor. Will you talk us through a little bit about that, just talk through that case study and what it's taught you about efforts to promote corporate accountability for human rights that has a broader consequence for how we understand supply chains, particularly as a human rights issue?
So 1 minute of background. I came out of government and I came to NYU and the president of the school said, why don't you go teach these human rights and business issues in the law school? And I said, no, I don't want to be in the law school. I want to be on home turf for the business community. Business people have an odd view of lawyers. They either manipulate them and use them, or they hate them. Those are kind of the options. And so I said, I don't want to be the lawyer telling businesses what to do. I want to be at home. I want them to feel at home. 5 weeks after we got to NYU, the factory complex in Bangladesh at Rana Plaza collapsed. 1,100, mostly young women, killed, 2,500 injured. It was the biggest industrial accident since Bhopal. And so a couple of things happened. So we jumped in. People when I came to NYU, people in the business school said, human rights, business, what does that have to do with one another? There was no human rights center in a business school anywhere in the world. And so Rana Plaza happened, and we said, my colleague who came with me and I said, we really ought to jump on this as the example that will explain what we're doing. So we dug in. We had a meeting in the fall, several months after the collapse. We brought in 6 or 7 governments, the World Bank, the ILO, a number of companies, Western companies, and the government of Bangladesh and some suppliers. And it was a kind of a raucous meeting. But I quickly realized a couple of things. One is this was high enough visibility that the brands, the Western brands, European and American, felt they had to do something. And so they created these 2 oversight groups called the Accord and the Alliance, where they actually took responsibility for going out to each of the factories where they had a direct relationship and doing an inspection and figuring out how did they protect against future disasters. And so they visited between the two organizations about 2,500 factories, which was a good thing. And factory conditions have really improved in those 12 years. But two other things occurred that became part of the challenge here. One is that they were very good, these factory inspections, in saying, you need fire doors, or you need a sprinkler system. And then they would turn to their suppliers, the local Bangladesh factory owner, and say, here's the list of things you have to do and pay for if you want our future business. So this sort of led me to think about the outsourcing of responsibility. You know, when Walmart comes in and says, all this needs to be fixed, but we're not going to pay for it. Here's a company making $600 billion a year in revenue, and they're telling a factory owner who has a factory with 500 employees, rebuild your factory. That doesn't seem right. So that's one lesson. The other was that, and this applies to any supply chain, certainly in the manufacturing sector, it's routinely the case that the Walmarts of the world would go to that factory and they'd say, we need 500,000 blouses by October 1st. They know full well that they're contracting with somebody who has no capacity to do that. And so they go, so they sign a contract, and the supplier, the factory owner, goes around the corner to his cousin, who's got a little shop on one side, to a friend down the street. 20 companies may be producing those things for Walmart. That was Rana Plaza. The day after the factory collapsed, all the brands had their people go and sift through the rubble to see if their brands were there. They had no idea because these were subcontracting factories. And so it was both, to me, Rana Plaza and Bangladesh was a sign. One, if there's enough attention and you get the industry to feel, my God, our reputation is on the line, they're going to do something. But secondly, they're not going to do enough unless they're constantly pushed.
And do you think, how far along the line are we in terms of an agreed set of outsourcing standards and accountability? I was saying earlier, it sort of reminds me of the command authority argument is, I didn't commit those massive violations. They were down the chain of command by some bad apples who are not accountable that I didn't know and I couldn't have known. In some ways, if you have a good with your label on it, it doesn't really matter. You know, I think you say in the book, you know, your name's on the bottle, your label's in the article of clothing. How far has the reality of accountability caught up with the law, or the law caught up with the reality?
I think the law is, at best, a guide, not a strict standard that's going to determine what people do, what companies do. You said earlier, and it's really true, these are tricky, complicated issues. And in the first instance, I'd say, if you're running a big global company, the first thing you need to do is say, we bear some responsibility for the people who are producing the things that are causing us to be profitable. Once you make that determination, then you have to say, and this is not, again, it's not a straight line, it's not a clear path, how far does that responsibility extend? And I think one of the challenges that some of the advocates have had is to say, you're responsible for everything all at once, and in fact, that's a tall demand. If you're making an iPhone, I asked somebody at Apple a few weeks ago, you know, what would it mean to move all your production out of China? Well, we have several thousand component parts in an iPhone coming from 30 countries. We don't ourselves even know where everything's coming from. Okay, so the reality is you can't do everything. The best is the enemy of the good. But I would say if companies take, and this is the approach I take with companies, you know, you need to look at how are you making money. What's your core business activity, and who's really essential to your making those profits? So if it's a manufacturing company, You have to, at a minimum, start by saying, where are those products being stitched and sewn and put together? It doesn't mean you necessarily have to find out where the thread was from, but you need to sort of figure it out as you go. It's an iterative process. And I think so often, because these are hard issues, and because the demand is so absolute, companies throw up their hands and they say, it's not possible for us to know any of this, it's too complicated, we'll leave that for somebody else. There is no somebody else. If they're making the money in this system, then the companies, the big brands and retailers need to take greater responsibility.
The deniability is no longer plausible.
That's right.
Okay, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. So your book, you kind of extol a litany of problems, from migrant workers to Yemen, to the murder of Khashoggi, to the export of Wahhabism. There's been, and these have ebbed and waned, but this is a place which has a particularly troubled human rights past and present. And yet, it owns major sports teams and has done so as part of a concerted diplomatic effort, has restored itself and rehabilitated itself globally in a rather extraordinary way, has been received by the President of the United States, or has received the President of the United States in his first trip abroad in a very sort of symbolic gesture. And you particularly scold, big iconic companies like McKinsey and BCG for involving themselves in hundreds and hundreds of contracts with the Saudi government after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, in instances where most reliable intelligence agencies say it's hard for that to have happened without perhaps the head of state himself knowing about it, or perhaps even having ordered it. So where do we draw the lines with Saudi? So the first thing I presume you say is a clear no, is you may not do a government contract with the government of Saudi Arabia. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would certainly say for a company like McKinsey, which has been made so much money contracting with MBS, that they've gone way over the line. I can't say no company ought to ever have a contract, but I'd be super careful about what you're being asked to do. The McKinsey example for me was particularly extreme, because they were not only, advising them on oil production or how Aramco ought to be more efficient. They were actually tracking dissidents and documenting, and they said it was for their own internal purposes. It was clearly on behalf of the government to get a better handle on who's being critical of you. That's way outside the boundaries to me.
So I guess the question then is where those boundaries exist, because I think the details on this, you can go, if you're involved in helping the Saudi government track dissidents when the Saudi government has killed dissidents, well documented, it's not my assertion, this is well documented by many independent sources, including governments, then that's a red line. But the gray areas are what's incredibly complex about this conversation. So if you can't contract with it, well, if you shouldn't as McKinsey do it, but does it mean if you're a small little PR company who rounds up in Riyadh and says, I'd like to talk about ecotourism and I'm going to promote a wonderful eco resort that happens to be, am I doing something that's ethically complicated? Should I be sanctioned?
I would say, as in so many of these things, you start by keeping your eyes open and asking the question. I can't answer for every small, medium enterprise you ever engage in any activity in Saudi Arabia, but I will say this. I think as a starting point, the issue to me of the day right now, and it's been an issue for a long time, is the manner in which the Saudis and the Gulf states recruit and treat migrant labor. I think that's a big issue which affects a whole lot of people. It affects the investment sector, certainly the construction sector, and all these games. The World Cup's going to be in Saudi Arabia in 2034. There are millions, literally, in the Gulf, there are 10 million construction workers all of them foreign, most of them overwhelmingly from South Asia. Almost all of them are paying their own recruiting fees. So they're paying the equivalent of a year's wage just for the privilege of going to work there. And then they're paying off the loans at usurious rates. That's an outrage to me. And that's the kind of thing that I think both Western governments and companies, anybody who's involved, for example, in NEOM, they have the modern pyramids are being built on the Red Sea. It's a $500 billion mega city. It's MBS's legacy project. And there are going to be millions of workers going to work there. That's an issue where I think companies and governments can put some pressure to say, this is not acceptable. We began to see actually the Qataris during the World Cup a few years ago begin to sort of ease some of the labor issues. That minimum wage for the first time. You can move between one job and another. Work conditions were better. So it's not impossible. The Saudis are holding out. And so I would say for me, if I look at Saudi Arabia, all the problems you identify, let's start with most important or biggest issue. That issue is how they treat foreign workers, and particularly these low-wage workers from South Asia.
So let's spill that over for a moment then. I'm a South African. Boycotts against apartheid were absolutely essential in ending apartheid, and the isolation of the regime with a terrible human rights track record was an essential part of what changed their calculus and how they behaved in the transition to democracy, the release of Nelson Mandela. So Saudi Arabia has done work in golf, and has done work in a bunch of major sports, and including in football, and football is a beloved subject. Soccer is a beloved subject here in their own Newcastle. Should the UK government or should the football regulator be looking at those transactions and saying that your use of slave labor and your human rights track record should prevent you from doing that, that there has to be a minimum set of standards to be an owner of a UK football club?
Yeah, I would start with FIFA and the World Cup. Again, we have a decade until the World Cup is in Saudi Arabia. They're going to build stadiums. They're going to build adjacent facilities. I think it's imperative that national governments, national teams, corporate sponsors, Coca-Cola and the like, right now start to say we have certain expectations. FIFA has pretended to have a human rights committee now for about a decade. It's not serious. The guy who runs FIFA is not serious. And I think that, to me, I'm a little less clear about buying a football team here in England. But I am clear that the link between the World Cup and those construction sites is so obvious. And so for anybody who's got any hand in preparing for 2034, this is the time to begin putting pressure on the Saudis. It happened in Qatar, but it happened too late. The Norwegian team and some others said, we're going to boycott. They put stuff on their jerseys. It was too little too late. And I think the corporate sponsors, Adidas, Coke, et cetera, Visa, all lost an opportunity to come together collectively and to say to FIFA, we've got to be part of the solution here than part of the problem.
So listening to you makes me, it's like that sort of famous Supreme Court, definition of pornography. You don't know what it is, but you know when you see it. It's sort of fuzzy and complex to sort of draw these gradations of where you stop and start and what's permissible and impermissible, which doesn't make the work more important. Indeed, it probably makes the work more important than ever. But if you go from, you shouldn't go and build the headquarters of the Saudi secret police. Bad. You shouldn't contract with the government just after they've killed a dissident. You shouldn't build a football stadium in Saudi unless you can be assured there isn't slave labor. But you can use Saudi money to buy a football team here even though it's all part of the same effort to burnish the Saudi government's regime. And then it gets even more complex. Couldn't you take Saudi sovereign wealth fund money to build solar panels or renewables somewhere else? And the answer probably is yes. It comes from the same place. It has tainted by the same original sin, and it's part of the same effort to support a regime that's problematic and autocratic. And yet, trying to give a morally consistent answer is super hard.
It's super hard. I tell my students, at the end of 13 weeks, you're going to be more confused than the day you walk in here. These are hard subjects. And there isn't a bright line often as to, again, I take a combination of a sense there have to be some principles, some standards, but there also has to be some practicality on what's possible. And those things sometimes butt up against each other. I'll give you one example. You mentioned solar panels. In 2022, the U.S. passed a law called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It said that any product coming from Xinjiang province in China, it couldn't come into the United States. There's a presumption that there's forced labor. And so I got a call from somebody in the White House, and they said, we're worried about solar panels because it seems like a lot of the solar panels are being produced in Xinjiang. So I went and did some digging, and it turns out that 98% of the ingots and wafers that are essential element of solar panels are produced in Xinjiang. The Chinese have totally taken over the solar panel market. And so I'm on the phone for an hour with the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, the White House, State Department. They said, tell us how to do a perfect solar panel. How can we bring solar panels in the United States in a human rights respecting way? And I said, the answer is you can't do it. And so they said to me, well, what should we do about that? And I said, I think you ought to go to the Congress and say, we need a 3-year waiver from this law, because otherwise we're going to make the Customs and Border Patrol have to look the other way. That's not an answer. But say for 3 years, we're not going to stop producing or importing solar panels. We have a climate emergency. But at the end of 3 years, we have to have alternatives. And that means the U.S. government investing in factories in South Korea or Vietnam or wherever. And they said, well, we can't do that. We'd be embarrassed by the Republicans in Congress. I think a lot of these questions come down to those kinds of choices. And so I don't think it's not unprincipled to say have a waiver for 3 years. You're balancing two tough issues or two tough interests. And it's better to have a plan to find out how to avoid solar panels coming only from a place where there's forced labor, and on the other side, trying to prevent solar panels from being part of an energy solution.
So that's interesting, because if I switched you out right now, this is a topic about business and human rights, right? And if I switch you out right now for colleagues we both know well at Human Rights Watch, and we took the kind of questions of accountability before the International Criminal Court and said, you're responsible for an international crime, most people would say, there's no balance, there's no nuance, there's no this, no that. You have to be held accountable, you have to be prosecuted, you have to be punished. And in fact, human rights are so inviolable that we have to be absolutely assiduous. There is a preemptory norms in international law which demand accountability. And you switch out of individual accountability and you put business into the picture, and then suddenly we become more morally elastic, and necessarily so. What happened that allowed us to do that intellectual shift?
Well, a couple things. I think the first most important point is that the human rights system that you and I have, grown up with and worked with for a long, long time was created by states for states. In 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt and the people around who created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights never spent 5 minutes talking about business. And there were no business people at the table. So I think if you start from the premise that we're just going to superimpose the human rights standards of governments and just say companies have to do exactly that, companies rightly are going to say, wait a minute, we weren't involved, we weren't at the table, we have different needs, we have different reality. We're not governments. There's things that governments can do that we can't do. All right, fair point. But then I would say, secondly, so you're not letting them off the hook, every industry has human rights problems. Every industry needs standards. That's back to laws or regulations and metrics and a way to be evaluated independently and held accountable. So the human rights premises still apply, but it has to be done industry by industry, and it has to be done in a way where companies can't run the table, they can't say what the standards are, but they need to be at the table because they need to be brought into the system in a way that governments were brought into the system in 1948 by the UN. So we're going to get there, and we've seen it in the apparel industry. I chair an organization called the Fair Labor Association, 25 years. We've got 40 apparel companies, 112 brands, now 10 agriculture companies, and Oxfam, and universities. And we, 25 years ago, created a set of standards, 9 standards, probably now 150 metrics, and an evaluation, an ongoing evaluation of those companies. That's the right way to do it, but the mining industry is not up for that, the tech sector is not up for that, God knows the investment sector is not up for that. And so we really just need to build those muscles, but I would say to our friends from Human Rights Watch, it's great what you do. You are, you know, you're asserting a standard of human rights that pushes everybody to do better, and importantly, you're documenting the problems in a way that tees these issues up to be discussed, but then the next, that takes you 30% of the way there. And then you have to figure out what do you do about it. And to me, the starting point is, how do you get industry competitors to the table? How do you set an industry standard? And then a meaningful way to evaluate and hold non-compliant companies accountable.
I both am a full adherent of that kind of multilateral incrementalism that you've articulated through the work of the Fair Labor Association. You started by saying that corporations are now more powerful than many governments. Slavery, where we started with the Fair Labor Association, a lot of its issues touch, where Rana Plaza touched, is if a state practiced slavery, it would be a crime against humanity. You'd hold them accountable. Corporations are now more powerful than states. They practice slavery in the form of the solar companies in Xinjiang, but also loads of other examples you see modern slavery being practiced. These more powerful entities than states we treat with greater, we give them more flexibility than we would give states.
That's right, and part of the reason is that, you know, states have signed up for a set of human rights standards.
Yeah.
Now, every country in the world, literally every country in the world, has ratified one or multiple treaties. Companies haven't done that.
Okay, but then the question is, if the companies do, well, firstly, do we really need them? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm with you on the theory there, Mike. Because do we need companies to say, I'm going to sign up to not involve myself in slavery, and I've got to wait for them to say they do it? Or don't we as democracies and states with sovereignty say to companies, I don't really care if you sign up or not, you may not practice slavery?
Yeah, and this is sort of back to what is going on in terms of government regulation. UK created the Modern Slavery Act, which was honestly a well-intended effort, but not a serious effort. And so it basically said to companies, you have to report on something. And there were companies would come back, half of them didn't report at all. There were no consequences. Others came back tick the box, not applicable, etc. Now we're going a step further. The Germans had a supply chain law with some real-world consequences. They've now backed off from that, but it's the right direction. And the European Union is finding a way to figure out what are those legal obligations. I'm all in favor of that. I think that's the right direction. And that, at the moment that happens, then companies are like states. They're being held to the legal standard, but it has to have consequences. There has to be clarity about what non-compliance is. A lot of the discussion around due diligence is a bit vague for my taste. Every company says we're doing due diligence, and I go to them and I say, what does that mean? Have working conditions improved? Are you doing content moderation better? Well, these are hard issues, they tell me. We're on a journey. If I hear another company tell me they're on a journey, I'm going to jump out of that window. You know, it's not, we have to get real. And that means we have to figure out what does it mean for the tech sector or the mining sector, agriculture. What are the substantive standards? And what does compliance look like? And most importantly, what's non-compliance look like? And what's the consequences for being an outlier? That's where in my judgment, that's where we're heading. It's not going to happen overnight. But again, I think there's clear evidence that that approach works better than every company being on a journey.
So let's talk about social media, because you've tipped your hand on that one, and there's some incredible stuff in this book around your engagement on that issue, especially with Nick Clegg and Facebook. There are two thorny issues here. One is multi-billion-dollar companies with arguably trillion-dollar market caps saying that they can't afford sufficient content moderation, just doesn't stack up. And so I think that one is sort of a clear hypocrisy, and you've called it out, and I think we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. The difficulty, I think, lies on the line between content moderation and free speech. And that is a genuine dilemma. So let's kind of take a hard example and get you to help us think it through. If you set up Twitter, now X, you strip away the content moderators, and a bunch of racist xenophobes get onto that platform and say that immigrants are responsible for a murder when they're clearly not. And you allow that to happen for days and days and days on end. And then people mobilize outside shelters and burn down those shelters and either kill people or put them at risk. Where does responsibility stop and start, and what would you call that responsibility?
So to begin with, again, because we're dealing with speech, regulation here is harder, but it's not impossible. And so we just did a report. We just had a meeting a month ago we brought in people from Google and Meta and TikTok to talk about government regulation of the social media technology industry. And their attitude is, I debated a woman from Google. She'd been at Google 10 years. She's now at Stanford Law School. She is brilliantly able to shoot down any regulatory proposal. You show a regulation, and she'll, within 30 seconds, have 10 reasons why it's impossible. And so I said, let's stop sort of talking about these particulars. Is it really possible that this industry, which has such profound impact on our society, on our politics, on our social interactions, that there isn't a single person in the US government that's overseeing regulating this industry? No, it was like I came in from Mars. You know, we're really smart out there in Silicon Valley. We're smarter than regulators who are kind of clumsy. The last thing we want is the EU regulators to tell us what to do. That's really about the Europeans being jealous that they're all American companies. And so at the end of the day, my answer to your question is we have to be respectful of speech, especially the US has an extreme version of its First Amendment. But that doesn't mean you can't regulate both to get better transparency in what's going on. Secondly, to look at the design of the algorithms. Google and Facebook don't give us a choice. We're the product that they're selling to advertisers. And they've figured out that the key to advertising success is engagement. The more we engage, the more hours we stay online, the more money they're going to make from advertisers. And people, all of us, we're human beings, we respond to things that are emotionally evocative. Hate and fear top the list every year. MIT's been doing studies for 15 years. People go online and they stay online because there's something they're afraid of or something they're angry about. And so the engagement model means that the company's algorithms are going to drive us to things that are going to be hateful and cause fear. We should be able, as users, to have a choice of algorithms. So there ought to be some look at how they're designed, and alternatives ought to be made available. And then the third thing, so transparency, design of the algorithms, and the third thing is the process by which the companies are overseeing content moderation. We've been trying for 8 years to get Meta to tell us how many people get a Meta paycheck for doing content moderation. They'll do ads and they'll say we have 35,000 content moderators. How many of them work for Meta? The answer is very few. They outsource this to Accenture, and Accenture finds young girls in the Philippines or India, pays them a few dollars an hour. They're working 16 hours a day. They're getting PTSD. That's, again, outsourcing of responsibility. So that should not be allowed. Without you, that doesn't answer your question of the bad content that's there, the harmful content. But when you get at how the companies run themselves, then you're really getting to the question of how they're dealing with various kinds of what I would call harmful content.
Final question, China. You can do the whole talk on China, but I'm just going to ask you about one question about movies, which were in your book, which I thought was astonishing. This, for the audience, this is... China now requires, if I'm correct, and maybe it's not as blanket as you state in the book, but perhaps it is, that that before films are distributed in China, they submit to censors who then either before or after look at the scripts. Spider-Man was asked to remove images of the Empire State Building from the kind of finale because it was too evocative of US freedom. And a James Bond film was, the entire script was rewritten based on Chinese censors' input, because the size of the Chinese movie market is twice the size of the US movie market. And so is the kind of clear guidance here, don't pre-obey, don't submit your documents, your films to the censors, and if they do, withdraw from the market?
Again, I don't have the clear answer, but the example that I give in the book, which is interesting, was Sony Pictures made this Spider-Man film, and Spider-Man was not climbing up the Empire State Building, he was climbing up the Statue of Liberty. And the Chinese censor says, you got to take that down. That's a symbol of America that we don't want in the film. And to their credit, Sony said no. And they negotiated how many seconds of the Statue of Liberty would be in the movie. And at the end of the day, Sony said, we're just not going to capitulate. And the film never was shown in China. It's the biggest movie market in the world. The film made $1.2 billion. They probably lost $200 million doing that. They never said it publicly. And I wrote something about it, and I called them and said, did you really do this? And they said, basically, yeah, but don't say it publicly.
Well, so that really hasn't worked out at all. Huh?
I give credit, they did the right thing. At the end of the day, I'm willing to give them credit. I was eager to give them credit. They just didn't want it.
Okay, I'm being told I need to turn over the mic, so your chance to ask Mike a few questions. Please, in the back. And please, let's keep them questions, not speeches, please.
Thanks very much. You spoke about the need for standards, and I noticed you didn't mention the main authoritative standard in this area, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I was wondering if there's a reason for that and what your thoughts are on them.
Yeah, so the UN Guiding Principles were created by Professor Ruggie, who I have a lot of respect for, 14 years ago, to basically open the door for a conversation. And it says that companies have some responsibility to respect human rights, but it's really governments that have the duty to protect human rights. That's a fine, I call that a framework. And then it says we have to have some remedies. It's not a substantive standard. And so my sense is that opened the door for a conversation, which is great, but it allows too much discretion, again, for every company to decide. I talk to a lot of companies that say, oh, we're following the UN Guiding Principles. And then I have the next bit of the conversation, what does that mean? Oh, we're exercising due diligence. That's nice. What does that mean exactly? Due diligence is a management concept that says if you're buying another company, you want to make sure there isn't a hidden lawsuit or something that's going to actually make the transaction less worthy. In this instance, you're asking companies to do due diligence, which is going to reveal a problem that's going to cost them more.
Just could you say a bit more about how you see the means by which we can generate more of that strength towards a genuine movement that's able to drive that regulatory standard? I see it, in the United States, there's still, even within the Trump administration, there are real forces in both directions. Elon Musk on one side and Vance perhaps on another for quite different reasons. But equally, around the world, we see different countries taking up those different stances of deregulation versus re-regulation. How do we build the forces that are able to really drive that regulatory standard that provides the minimum floor of corporate behavior?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the answer is, it's typically the case that if individual companies are not nervous about regulations, trade associations hate them. And so you have enormous pressure coming now against the Europeans, for example. They've delayed the due diligence directive by 2 years. The Germans are backing away. That's because there's corporate pressure to say, we don't want to be regulated so aggressively. Now, some of those regulations may be inefficient, too many record keeping. There's real discussions about how to do it well, but I would say the way to sort of make sure we're serious about regulation is that there needs to be counter pressure from consumers, from investors, from people in this room who say, no, at the end of the day, companies are never going to do all that they need to do unless they get a kick in the pants. And that kick in the pants is governments regulating their behavior. There has to be some consequence.
Please, back there.
Hi, thank you very much. I was a bit concerned in your opening levels about what was the trends going forward, that you didn't put investor and shareholder action as one of those driving forces to kind of make change. So therefore, I'd like to ask, how well are investors, putting pressure on companies to change, and what's the direction of travel in terms of how is that getting better or worse?
So my answer to that is probably conditioned by the fact that I'm at a business school that's 2 miles from Wall Street. And I live with the ghost of Milton Friedman. The idea that the only thing that really matters is short-term returns on investment. That is very much the dominant American view. I know it's not the view here or in the EU countries. But I don't think the investment community, even here or in the EU countries, has done enough. I think at the end of the day, I love the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. They actually are doing the right thing by building an ethics committee and the like. There's some funds, mutual funds in Europe that are raising these questions as they should. There's this concept of double materiality, which is in the right direction, where investors are saying not only the Milton Friedman standard, but we have to look at the social, environmental consequence of what companies are doing. We put out a paper about 2 years ago saying there need to be values funds, and maybe you separate the E and the S, but there need to be funds that actually evaluate empirically with data which companies are doing the best on climate or on global supply chain or on diversity, whatever the issue is, and give investors that alternative. None of the big investment firms have those funds. There's $30 trillion in ESG funds, but those funds are all doing the same thing. They're evaluating risks to investors, not people or the planet. I went to one of the big U.S. investment funds, and I said, why didn't you try this out? Have a values fund. And the answer was, this is the person in charge of ESG, multi-trillion-dollar company, and she said to me, oh, we would never do that. And I said, why not? And she said, if we did that, then everybody would know our other ESG funds are bullshit. The comms guy who was on the line ended the interview at that moment. So we need to get real about what investors are doing.
And just a quick thing, but in Mike's book, there's a reference to the Hobby Lobby case in the US Supreme Court. What's really interesting there is talk about unlikely bedfellows. There's an arbiter in that case which says that a shareholder value is not the only thing that corporations should be thinking about in the mouths of this Supreme Court. So if you're looking for arguments to buttress this argument, this Supreme Court can be your friend on this instance. Please.
Hi. I just wonder, obviously apart from shareholder pressure, the pressure to make money and all of that, another big driving force within corporations is their legal department and their compliance department. And I sometimes ask myself if it's worth going back to first principles, to how law is taught to students, so that winning is not the goal, but the best for everybody is the goal. And I use, when I think about that, the example of Shell. If they'd taken that route 30 years ago, they wouldn't still be in The Hague around Nigeria.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I think one of the challenges of lawyers and compliance officers is the what I call chalk on the boots. We had a head of the CIA, Michael Hayden, during the War on Terror, who told his agents, you have to follow the law, but get chalk on your boots. Walk right up to the line. And so I worry that too many lawyers and compliance agents are telling companies, here's what you have to do, here's what you're not allowed to do, rather than here's what you need to do. And so it can be a value to have the lawyer pushing, but it sometimes can be a distraction or an impediment if the lawyer says, you get, we can get chalk on our boots, but we can't go over the line. But in fact, we're not answering the question, is performance changing? Are we doing the right thing? I always say the difference between a good lawyer and a great lawyer. Good lawyer will tell you what the law is. You can't do this. A great lawyer will say, what's the problem and how do we solve it?
Can you just, we're going to have to end on this. The law firms in the United States who have exercised pre-obedience and have bent the knee and said, not only we won't do anything that angers the current administration, but we will give you hundreds of millions of pounds in pro bono dollars. This seems to be a different, incarnation of the same problem, which is it's not just not saying what the law is, it's bending to power when power just, blinks at you. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's truly sad that the legal community, which ought to be upholding the rule of law, is now both capitulating, as you say, bending the knee, but is afraid to challenge a whole range of illegal things. The big law firms are shying away from representing immigrants who are being deported illegally or representing others in cases where the administration is overreached. One of the things I've been saying to some of the big law firms is pick a big case, pick a case like the moment at which the administration says habeas corpus doesn't apply to non-citizens. And 10 of the law firms, or 15 of the biggest law firms, ought to file that case together, represent the immigrant, whoever it is, and say, we're going to stand together. Trump's been really effective in picking off one and then another, whether it's universities or law firms or whatever, making them a kind of showcase for, look, we're going to tell you who's in charge. He's a bully, and he's got people around him that are pretty smart about dividing and conquering. We need the legal community to come together and say, we actually stand for the rule of law, and we're going to do it together so we're not going to be picked off.
I'm being told that we have to stop. So Mike will be available to sign books and then has got to hightail out of here to his next appointment. But I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to extend an enormous vote of thanks to somebody who has been working in this field for 3 decades or more. In government, in NGOs, and now in academia, and I think has led with clarity in a field where there's an enormous amount of obfuscation and ambiguity, and has helped put a thumb on the scales for human rights in the corporate world. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.